In 1962, the United States was ready to start World War III to rid its backyard of Soviet nukes. Within a decade, each superpower was living with a knife at its throat. Each side now dispersed its missiles around the world, poised for launch at a moment's notice. Each could now launch by land, sea, or air, and each now wielded so many warheads that even if one side struck without warning, the other could utterly destroy it. This stalemate spawned the most terrifying idea anyone had heard of: mutual assured destruction. Today, the danger isn't over. Tomorrow could be Doomsday.
The arms race went on and on, not to frighten the enemy, but to make sure that there is no reason to attack us. These weapons became a weapon to hold them away. It's like having two scorpions in a bottle where they cannot fight because they do not have space to maneuver. At the same time, they know for sure they're able to kill each other, and this is why they remain quiet.
By the early 1970s, the most terrifying weapon in the nuclear arsenal was the submarine. 24 hours a day, Soviet subs cruised invisibly off the eastern seaboard and the west coast. Without warning, they could lob warheads onto New York, Los Angeles, or Washington, D.C. A strike so sudden and so precise that it could prevent any retaliation at all. This new strategy was called decapitation. American subs posed the same threat to Moscow. In neither fleet were nuclear weapons equipped with safety locks. In this atmosphere of mutual terror, the superpowers maneuvered for global influence.
In Africa, there was enough for some warlord to say that he was going to build socialism in his country, and the Soviet Union would start providing him with arms, and another warlord would say he was against communists, and the United States would provide him with arms.
And so the game went around the world. The Middle East is the most fought over land on Earth. The home of the oldest feud in history, and the site of a great battle more than 3,000 years ago called Armageddon.
The most dangerous nuclear confrontation period happened during the so-called Yom Kippur War in the early 70s. At that point, the imbalance that had existed between Russia or the Soviet Union and the United States in strategic nuclear missilery had largely disappeared.
October 6, 1973 was Yom Kippur, the holiest day of the Jewish calendar. That day, Egypt and Syria launched a surprise attack on Israel. The attackers were armed by the Soviet Union. The Israelis were armed by the United States.
We were flying supplies then from west to east into Israel. And the Russians were flying supplies then from north to south in Cairo, so we were crossing all the time. It was a amusing situation in a sense if it wasn't so serious.
2 weeks later, the United Nations brokered a ceasefire. But 2 days after that, the Israelis took the offensive. In the Sinai Desert, they surrounded an entire Egyptian army. On October 24th, at 9:35 p.m., the Soviet ambassador in Washington relayed a message from Leonid Brezhnev to Richard Nixon, 2 new players on the nuclear stage.
He sent a letter to him, President Brezhnev, to President Nixon, saying, look here, it looks to us that really Israel doesn't pay attention. Neither to us, neither to you. So you have to use all you have in power. If Israel will continue this aggressive course, maybe we will need to send military contingents from you and from us to stop in order to enforce ceasefire.
The letter didn't end there. Unbeknownst to the rest of the Soviet leaders, Brezhnev, alone and drunk in the Kremlin, added a personal threat. I will say it straight, he wrote, that if you find it impossible to act jointly with us in this matter, we would be faced with the necessity of urgently considering the question of taking appropriate steps. Brezhnev then ordered his paratroops to mobilize for an invasion. Alarmed, Secretary of State Henry Kissinger tried to buy time.
Kissinger was a little bit worried, of course, because he didn't like to have Soviet troops in the Middle East. So he rushed to the president, and then he called me from my telephone and said, look here, President asked to wait a little bit, but we have to think it over.
With no time to lose, Kissinger sat down at 10:40 p.m. in the White House Situation Room with Secretary of Defense James Schlesinger, CIA Director William Colby, Chairman of the Joint Chiefs Thomas Moorer, and White House Chief of Staff Alexander Haig.
I was there representing the president, who felt that it wasn't appropriate for him to be there just yet.
We reviewed not only the letter, which we regarded as threatening, but the actions of Soviet air, which we could detect through our intelligence capabilities.
As a general practice, if you conduct an airborne operation, you want to drop the troops during the day. We knew that we had about 2 hours, if that, to make a decision.
At 11:41 p.m., they made their decision. They raised the entire U.S. Armed Forces from DEFCON 5 to DEFCON 3. At U.S. air bases, B-52s loaded with nuclear weapons lined up nose to tail. In missile silos, launch commanders buckled themselves into their chairs. 2 carriers raced to the eastern Mediterranean, and nuclear-armed submarines sped to secret rendezvous off the Soviet coast, prepared to launch. Henry Kissinger was ready for a showdown.
I don't want anyone to think, this was some wild cowboy who made a wild decision. This was a decision. It was arrived at in a collective meeting of the National Security Council.
Nixon's role that night remains in dispute. Some say the president, mired in the Watergate scandal, was too depressed to come downstairs.
Nixon had started drinking and was drunk. Haig refused to call him to the telephone. So the men authorized a DEFCON 3 alert on their own.
Hague disagrees.
We made the recommendation and decided on the actions that should be taken, and I presented them to the president on the telephone.
We may, because of our concern about the Soviet perception of American paralysis, have taken an action that some would regard as too strong. There was no difference within that room with regard to the need to deliver a powerful message.
The Soviets got the message. They put their own nuclear forces on alert. 200 million Americans were closer to the brink than they knew. Kissinger wanted to spook the Soviets, not his countrymen. So he ordered the move to DEFCON 3 be kept secret. Americans went to bed unaware they were 2 steps away from war. Before they woke up, the secret was out. In the dead of night, a reservist rushing back to his base in Maryland was pulled over for speeding.
So the cop says, "What the hell are you going so fast for?" He says, "We're on alert." And of course that hits the papers, and it was all over the town by daylight.
At 5:40 a.m. in Washington, Soviet Ambassador Anatoly Dobrynin got a rude awakening. It was Kissinger's reply to Brezhnev. No Soviet troops would be allowed to set foot in the Mideast. In a high-stakes game of nuclear poker, Henry Kissinger had just upped the ante. During the night, Moscow satellites had detected the U.S. alert. But Moscow hadn't told Dobrynin. He found out the same way everyone else in America did. On the morning news.
And it is the ambiguity of some of the actions and communications and certain readiness measures that were observed that caused the President at a special meeting of the National Security Council last night at 3 a.m. to order certain precautionary measures.
I was very angry. I called Kissinger and said, "Henry, what's going on? What kind of alert? Are you going to want war with us?" And he said, no, nothing to do. I said, "Why you put it there?" Well, he said, there was some reason, but there are some domestic reason. But you could tell the President Brezhnev right now that tomorrow alert will be put away.
Kissinger then proposed sending observers to the Mideast, not troops. Brezhnev accepted.
It was a deliberate overreaction on the part of Henry Kissinger to make quite clear that we were not buckling under Soviet pressure.
Old General Forrester in the Civil War said, "Whoever gets there fastest with the mostest prevails." And in crisis management, that's the way you've got to play these games, to have the other side reconsider. If you take weak, incremental steps, that has a built-in incentive with it for the other side to match what you're doing and up the ante.
I think it was some people were probably, Americans, like to create the impression that they save Middle East, save Israel, I don't know who else, from military intervention from us. There was no intention at all.
It was very tempting for American political authorities to believe that they could follow in the footsteps of John Kennedy and issue nuclear threats. At the same time, American political authorities underestimated the risk that things could go wrong.
A few years later, in the heart of America, something would go terrible. Looks for trouble around the clock. If they find it, they'll tell the president. But if they're wrong, they'll be making the biggest mistake in history. On November 9th, 1979, they couldn't make up their minds. At exactly 8:50 a.m., NORAD's radar screens were lit up by hundreds of specks streaming across the North Pole.
I show incoming missiles from all over the U.S.S.R.
NORAD's duty officer had just 3 minutes to confirm that what he saw was what he thought it was, an all-out Soviet attack.
We have a situation here. Where's that confirmation?
His staff anxiously dialed their radar sites. They hadn't detected any missiles.
Clear can't verify, sir.
As seconds ticked by, the Pentagon's Deputy Director of Operations demanded a report.
I don't know.
And he finally said, if somebody can't explain this to me in 30 seconds, I'm going to convene a missile attack conference.
Sir, I still show incoming missiles from all over.
No one could explain it.
No confirmation from anybody yet.
At Andrews Air Force Base near Washington, D.C., the President's command post for waging nuclear war taxied to the runway. Across the country, B-52 bombers loaded with nuclear weapons prepared for takeoff. Fighters were already scrambling to intercept enemy bombers. It seemed World War III had begun. Hidden deep in Cheyenne Mountain in Colorado Springs lies the world's greatest computer system. Its job is to detect incoming missiles and give the President enough warning time to launch a counterattack. This strategy is called launch on warning.
Launch on warning requires assessment of an incoming missile attack 3 or 4 minutes after the attack begins. Requires anywhere from 4 or 5 minutes to perhaps as much as 10 minutes for a presidential decision, and then requires another 5 minutes to retaliate. It's really a very, very tightly scripted operation that allows absolutely no room for mistake, allows very little time for rational thought.
This is no way to go to war. This has surrendered political choice to the machinery.
That day in Colorado, mankind's fate rested with a machine.
We need confirmation.
One by one, radar stations reported to NORAD. None detected incoming missiles. The most sophisticated computer system in the world had sent a false alarm. The Pentagon canceled the alert. The President's command post returned to its hangar. The man now in charge of America's nukes, Jimmy Carter, wasn't even notified. If he had been, he would have had just 5 minutes to decide whether to push the button. The Air Force hurried to bury its mistake.
The hotline at my desk to the command center rang, and I picked it up, and it was the command director who said, we just had this little event happen, and but it's over now, and everything's taken care of, and don't worry about it. And I said, okay, thank you very much, and hung up.
Bruce Brown did worry. He sensed there was more to it than he'd been told. There was. NORAD was about to train radar operators how to detect missile attacks. But no one could get the training tape to work.
So they called back down to the headquarters and said, we can't make it run. And somebody said, go get the J tape and see if that'll run.
Bernard?
The J-tape simulated an all-out nuclear attack on the United States. Worse, the computer reported that this was the real thing. When the Pentagon learned that Armageddon was almost started by a training tape, it tried to suppress the snafu. But when it went on alert, the Pentagon had notified key airports to get ready to clear the skies. At Dulles Airport, a reporter just happened to be in the control tower and overheard everything. Next, the Pentagon blamed the guy who inserted the training tape, but he was just a scapegoat.
That crew should have detected that it was not real. Any attack of that magnitude surely would have been detected by the ground site controlling the satellite that was sending the warning messages. Like it or not, there are some of us who, no matter how much we train, when faced with the real event, will just freeze.
Imagine if you were in the hot seat at NORAD, and really this was your only job for the rest of your life, and it could only happen one time, and that's that if the enemy launched a sudden attack, you have 3 or 4 minutes to find out what's going on and to notify the president and brief the president when he comes on the line of what you know about that attack. And oh, by the way, don't make any mistakes.
NORAD quickly moved its training to a separate location. The damage to America's credibility took longer to repair.
The Secretary of Defense and the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs were in Brussels at a NATO ministerial meeting. A representative from Brussels got up and sort of said, if this is what being under the American nuclear umbrella means, we just soon go it alone. Because we think the chances of the Soviets attacking from the blue are apparently somewhat less than you cowboys getting it started by accident.
4 years later, it looked like the cowboys were getting it started right out of the clear blue. November 1st, 1983, Korean Airlines Flight 007 took off from Alaska, bound for South Korea. At 2 a.m., the jet strayed into Soviet airspace. The Soviets decided to take a closer look. "90 minutes later, an American listening post in Japan picked up a single message from a Soviet fighter pilot. Zapustka, missile away. All 269 people on board perished. The Soviets insisted the jet was a spy plane. The rest of the world was outraged.
What can we think of a regime that so broadly trumpets its vision of peace and global disarmament, and yet so callously and quickly commits a terrorist act to sacrifice the lives of innocent human beings?
The Soviets wondered what President Ronald Reagan would do. They soon found out. In 1980, candidate Reagan feared America was trailing the Soviet Union. He pledged to close the window of vulnerability.
So in your discussions of the nuclear freeze proposals, I urge you to beware the temptation of pride.
Upon taking office, Reagan didn't just beef up the military. He stepped up the war of words.
to ignore the facts of history and the aggressive impulses of an evil empire, to simply call the arms race a giant misunderstanding.
The evil empire speech alarmed the empire's new leader, a man paranoid about the West. Yuri Andropov. Andropov called Reagan insane and accused him of preparing to annihilate the Soviet Union.
The Soviet Union, almost throughout its history, suffered from a paranoid strain in its understanding of the outside world. And what Reagan did was to raise that paranoid interpretation of the United States to dangerous levels.
I think there was a feeling that Ronald Reagan was too ideologically inclined and sometimes not enough educated, if I may say so.
2 weeks after his evil empire speech, Reagan announced his Strategic Defense Initiative. Satellites armed with lasers to shoot down Soviet missiles. To pundits, it was Star Wars versus the evil empire. But Moscow wasn't laughing.
They thought, now if the Americans have a shield against our missiles, then the Americans and the West can take us with bare hands. All right, we will destroy Western Europe, but so what? The United States would remain intact.
Against this backdrop of paranoia, the KGB launched an unprecedented spy campaign, Operation Rion, from the Russian initials for Surprise Nuclear Rocket Attack. Its mission, to look for signs of Doomsday. Oleg Gordievsky, the KGB's chief agent in London, received a long list of warning signs.
They said, remember, a preparation to a sudden nuclear attack on us would take the West between 7 and 10 days. They will have to carry out important consultations between the prime ministers, presidents. The preparation will start at the nuclear bases. The American embassy will show a lot of activity.
The KGB believed another clue to impending war would be a jump in the fees offered to British blood donors.
Nobody in the London residency likes to tell Moscow Center that British blood donors are not actually paid for their blood, because to tell Moscow Center that might be to suggest that Moscow Center was ludicrously ignorant of what went on in Britain.
The KGB wanted what it expected. Agents obliged, even when they had to make it up.
You should report about something. If you haven't noticed anything, you are a poor officer. You can be recalled and punished.
In Moscow, nerves were shot. The British knew it because they had a double agent, Oleg Gordievsky. When he revealed Moscow thought nuclear war was coming, the British warned the CIA. They just let Moscow keep sweating. Then, on September 1st, the Soviets shot down KAL Flight 007. In a rare move, the Soviets sent out a Molniya, a flash message warning agents in Western Europe to brace for an American attack. It looked like it was coming. NATO began testing procedures to launch the new Pershing IIs about to be deployed in West Germany. The tests were just part of a war game, and the Soviets knew it. That's why they were so scared.
The contingency plan that the Warsaw Pact, the armed forces of the Soviet Union and its Soviet bloc allies had for a surprise attack on the West was to have an exercise, pretend that it was just a military exercise, but actually use that exercise to begin war in earnest. This was the most dangerous moment of the Cold War since the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962.
The KGB thought NATO had gone on nuclear alert. The countdown might even have started. On November 8th, the Soviet nuclear bombers in East Berlin went on alert. By now, one spark could set the world ablaze. 3 days later, the war game ended. But the Soviets remained jumpy.
So eventually the message went to President Reagan. Do something about it. The Russians are becoming dangerous in their nervousness.
3 months after the war game ended, Ronald Reagan sat down with Ambassador Anatoly Dobrynin.
He asked me a very direct question. Mr. Ambassador, does your government believe that I could launch sudden attack against the Soviet Union? My answer was like this one. Said, look here, I don't believe that they believe that you could launch sudden attack, but that all what you are doing looks very convincingly to my government that you're preparing for war.
In time, both sides cooled off. Within a decade, the Cold War would thaw, but another crisis would flare up.
9, 8, 7, 6, 5.
The 25th of January, 1995, got off to a bad start. In collaboration with the U.S., Norway launched a weather rocket into the stratosphere. The Russians were notified, but their radar teams never got the message.
They could detect that it was a very powerful launch. The height was different from a weather rocket. The starting speed was much faster than a weather rocket. It was an unexpected event.
The rocket's shape and trajectory resembled an American Trident missile, the kind carried by U.S. nuclear submarines. And it was launched from an area thought to be patrolled by U.S. subs. If World War III ever began, Russian radar crews thought they'd be the first to find out. Now it seemed America had just fired the first shot.
So the people on duty found themselves in a very difficult position. If they kept quiet and the rocket landed on Russian territory, then who's to blame? They had to make a decision. They only had a few seconds.
They alerted their commanding general. He, in turn, immediately alerted President Boris Yeltsin via the nuclear briefcase. The briefcase is a remote communications link that lets Russia's leaders fire nuclear weapons at a moment's notice. The President of the United States has a similar device. It's called the football. For the first time in history, an alert had reached the nuclear briefcase. It seemed one American missile was already streaking toward Russia. Before any more were fired, Yeltsin could choose to respond with everything he had, including his most powerful missile, the SS-18, nicknamed Satan. Each carries 10 warheads. One warhead can take out New York City. Yeltsin could destroy every American missile silo and still blanket the rest of the country. On January 25th, 1995, this was the power at Boris Yeltsin's fingertips. Only 5 years before, the world awoke from its long nuclear nightmare. Europe was celebrating the end of the Cold War. The Berlin Wall, the war's oldest and gravest symbol, was at last coming down. The divided city was united and free. By 1991, Soviet troops, an occupying army for 5 decades, began to withdraw from Eastern Europe. By Christmas of that year, the Soviet Union no longer existed. To stave off bankruptcy, Russia began to cannibalize its mighty war machine. Tank production plummeted by 95%. Officers and troops went unpaid and unhoused. Russia even skimped on gas. To the relief of their old enemy, the Russians ended their submarine patrols in American waters, and they stopped drawing a bead on the U.S.
For the first time since the dawn of the nuclear age, there is not a single Russian missile pointed at America's children.
But it was just a dream. Our nuclear nightmare wasn't over.
Well, the hair trigger is just as dangerous and just as short today as it was 10 years ago. Despite an agreement between President Yeltsin and Clinton to stop aiming missiles at each other, that agreement is more symbolic than real. It takes only 10 seconds to target missiles on both sides. And as for missiles that might be fired accidentally, there is some safety derived from this agreement because a U.S. missile would land in the oceans instead of on a Cold War target in Russia. But unfortunately, the Russians did not re-target their missiles for the oceans. And so an accidental Russian launch would result in a warhead landing in the United States because their system requires that the missile go to its Cold War target if it's fired accidentally.
Also left over from the Cold War was a device for launching missiles automatically. The Russians call it the dead hand system. The Pentagon calls it the Doomsday machine. In case of nuclear attack, the Russian president can order the general staff to retaliate. That order will ultimately be obeyed, even if no one's left alive to obey it.
The general staff can choose to press a button that fires the weapons at remote control, bypassing people all the way down the chain of command.
A single Russian missile is launched. In mid-flight, it broadcasts pre-recorded launch orders to 4,700 other warheads. It said God created the world in 6 days. Men can destroy it in 1 hour. On January 25th, 1995, Boris Yeltsin faced the greatest decision of any man's life. As an unknown missile soared over Russia, Boris Yeltsin wondered if Doomsday had arrived.
There were a few minutes when the president, the defense minister, and the chief commander were quite worried, if not stressed, by the situation. What if it was a real missile? What if it was going to drop on our heads?
Yeltsin chose to wait and see. For 9 minutes, all that stood between the U.S. and annihilation was one man with a drinking problem. Finally, the missile began to reveal its path. It was moving away from Russia. The danger had passed. For now. Boris Yeltsin later speculated that the West was just testing Russia's early warning systems.
Maybe somebody decided to check us out, and we showed them it didn't take a second to find out from where, what speed, and where it's going to land.
Whatever the interpretation, the Norwegian incident is a bleak reminder that Armageddon is still poised on the launch pad. With the Soviet Union dissolved, Russia is no longer the superpower it was, but it still packs a heavy nuclear punch, an estimated 24,000 warheads.
I can easily envisage a situation when the future Russian leader may say, all right, my army is small, I can't invade another country because I don't have the resources. But my nuclear weapons are numerous and penetrating and accurate, and I will use them instead.
And who will control those nukes? An elected president or a renegade general? Judging by a CIA report leaked to the press, the greater danger is posed by sheer neglect. Russia admits it doesn't track its nuclear stockpiles well enough to know whether anything has been stolen. It's not the bombs that outlaw nations covet, but the uranium or plutonium cores, each as small as a grapefruit. Already, gangsters and terrorists have been arrested trying to smuggle them out. For all the frightening uncertainty of the Cold War, everyone knew who had the bomb and where it was aimed. The Americans and the Soviets were locked in a Mexican standoff, each side afraid to fire first because both had too much to lose. Now, it's every man for himself. The nuclear club is like a fraternity. It's very exclusive, and everyone wants to get in. In 1945, the United States was the only member. Today, 8 nations belong, maybe more. Human nature makes it certain membership will keep growing.
Every invention in the 30,000 years since modern human beings first began to appear on this planet has spread around the world. Now, we can slow down proliferation. We can't prevent it.
As newcomers plan for safeguarding their weapons, they'll look to America and Russia as models.
They will be doing that with the false belief that everything went well during the Cold War, and that we did not have the serious false warning incidents, command and control problems, and near accidents.
There's a mathematical principle that if any event has a probability greater than 0, the longer you go and the more trials you have, sooner or later it becomes a mathematical certainty that the event will occur.
More than half a century has passed since that summer day that changed the world. We've grown so used to life with the bomb, we forget tomorrow could be Doomsday. Yet the experts say the day may come when a bomb will again fall on some great city. We'll be going to school, going to work, going about our lives, just as on that bright August day in Hiroshima. Like them, we won't be expecting the end of the world. Once more, it will come in the blink of an eye.